Okay, so welcome to the Funding Impact Measurement Working Group for September 10th. This is our first meeting after the break, so if you want to add yourself to the agenda and tell us anything fun you did in August while we were on a meeting break. I visited friends and family in Oregon and Ohio, which was nice. So feel free to add your something fun that you did during August. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to mention is that on September 24th, so that's our next meeting, that's in 2 weeks, we're going to do a feedback session on this working group. So what we want to do is have people kind of come prepared to talk about what's worked well, what you'd like to see change, what topics you want to see in future meetings. Kaylin has some ideas for facilitating that. So we want to do that in 2 weeks, but we wanted to give people a heads up so you can start thinking about what you might want to bring up. And I'll post that in the Slack channel as well for the people who aren't going to be in this meeting. We do have we are continuing the research slide series. So as a reminder, those are very short 5 to 10 minute presentations covering some interesting bit of research. So something you read, something you're working on. And Paul is going to do the next one on the 24th. So he's going to give a presentation about some of the stuff they've been doing. That's Paul Sherritt from the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany, Sovereign Tech Agency. So he's going to talk about some of the data that they've been collecting, which should be interesting. And if anybody wants to do an update on October 8th, just reach out, let me know. And we can get that scheduled. Or a future one, the 22nd, some future meeting. We do have one upcoming presentation, October 22nd. So the state of open source funding data. So this is some data that Andrew Nesbitt's been gathering from ecosystems. And he presented a very short version of this data on at CHAOSScon in Open Source Summit North America. But he's made some updates to it, and we're going to give him more time than just the short 10 minutes that he did at CHAOSScon. So he's going to do kind of a deep dive into some funding data that he's been collecting. So I think that should be really interesting. And then a couple of reminders. There's a Digital Resilience Forum in Madrid on October 29th. So it's being organized by Bitergia and a few others. But it should be an interesting place to talk about things like digital sovereignty, to talk about metrics. It's quite a wide range of things that we're going to cover in that meeting. So I'd encourage you to have a look. It's actually free to attend. You have to apply. But realistically, I think anybody that would come from this group would just get approved automatically. The applying is just more to weed out, bots and things. So I would encourage you, if you're in and around Madrid or close there by October 29th, I think it's going to be a really interesting event. They've got people from the UN, I think some people from OFE are going to be there, Sovereign Tech Agency. So they've got a really good group of people, and I think it would be really relevant to a lot of the conversations we have in this group. And then Voss Backstage, which I know is not until March, but the CFP closes in October. So if you're interested in going to that event, they had some funding talks there last year. I would encourage you to submit a proposal. And if there are any other reminders, feel free to add them. There are probably other events going on that I just don't know about, so don't hesitate to add those there, and we always carry the reminders over to the next meeting as well. Okay, any questions on the housekeeping items? Okay, very good. I will stop sharing so that Nick can take over, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So many familiar faces on the call, so apologies, some of you might have heard a version of this before, either at the Open Source Summit or at OFE's community webinar. But really what we're trying to do is to get out the word about our case for an EU-wide sovereign tech fund. So yeah, really excited to discuss this effort with you all. I kind of previewed it, I think, in the spring when Caitlin was generous enough to invite me to a call. And what I'll show you now is kind of the actual findings of the report, and kind of how we're actioning them going forward, and some opportunities where you all might be able to get involved and contribute. So I will start my presentation now. So if you scan the QR code with your phone, or you go into the chat later, I'll add the link as well. You can find our report. It's available at eu-stf.openforumeurope.org. And in that report, we kind of outline all of the aspects of what we're about to present here. We did set out to write a 30-page white paper, and we ended up writing a 90-page report. Which happens, but we'll also be producing a policy brief version, so a shorter, more digestible version intended for policy makers and decision makers. And that version of the study is going to be released towards the end of this month. So we'll do kind of a second wave of kind of promotion around that. And hopefully that'll be a more digestible way for some folks to consume the findings. And it'll coincide with some events that we have coming up in Brussels as well. So here are some of the authors of the study. So this was a collaboration between Open Forum Europe, represented by myself and Astor, with Fraunhofer ISI, including Carsten Schwabe, Andreas Humler, and Professor Knut Blind, as well as the European University Institute, including Professor Thomas Streins, but also his students, PhD student Jennifer Trudell, who some of you may know, and master student Rosa Maria Tarraco. They did a lot of excellent legal analysis for us. Why do a feasibility study for an EU sovereign tech fund now? I covered some of this in our previous kind of intervention with the CHAOSS group, but I'll summarize it kind of more succinctly, hopefully now, because we've kind of had time to gather our thoughts. Really what we're talking about now is the need for mission-driven investment in open digital infrastructure. So building on some of the language of Mariana Mazzucato, we're really kind of leaning in on kind of open source as kind of a mission for Europe and cross-cutting all of its digital technology investments. And that includes a lot of the regulation, but also the public policy initiatives like the Open Internet Stack that are emerging now. Really that language of the kind of German sovereign tech fund around open digital-based technologies is still very relevant here. So what we're talking about is not investing in applications and services necessarily. Really what we're talking about is kind of one level down. But again, these distinctions are kind of fuzzy, but really it's around taking some of the most base and fundamental technologies that are relevant for the sustainability and security of the infrastructure we depend on, the digital infrastructure we depend on, and making sure that those are secure. I articulate this a little bit. The tragedy of the commons metaphor isn't perfect, so we problematize it a little in the report, but I talk a little bit, going back to kind of Egball's definition in Roads and Bridges, around a kind of dual tragedy of the commons and how that relates to kind of the need for this type of mission-driven investment, and why it's important to actually invest in human resources. We also make a case for why the diversification of funding is important, and why that can stand in contrast to kind of private or market-driven sustainability models, which we'll talk a little bit about soon. So this is context that a lot of you will be familiar with, but there was the Heartbleed crisis that kind of broadly precipitated the FOSSA funding, and then there was Log4j, which largely preceded the Sovereign Tech Agency. We're kind of waiting for our crisis to help really kind of catalyze the moment, but there's been a lot of discussion around XZ utils and a number of these kind of vulnerabilities that have raised conversations around what it means to have, more eyeballs on open source code, but also to invest in the human resources behind these projects. Again, you can't equate these issues necessarily perfectly, but really what we see is kind of a consistent drumbeat of these opportunities for investment emerging, because these vulnerabilities keep happening, and they raise awareness of kind of our dependency on these types of technologies. Hopefully not revolutionary information for you all, but context that we need to provide. And in terms of why we're doing it now, it's important to think about kind of the Brussels policy side. So we're not doing this now because we need to convince you all. What we're doing this now for is to convince EU policymakers and decision makers. So right now we're in the middle of, with the new European Commission, the kind of development of a new multi-annual financial framework. And that's a result of kind of a complex negotiation between the European Commission, European Parliament, with input from the European Council. And those negotiations are ongoing, but they began in July, around the time when we released the first version of the study, and the timing was not accidental. Really why we're making the case right now for this type of investment is that there's clear and documented economic benefits of open source software investment. This is going back to a study that OFE worked on in 2021, which kind of quantified some of the value for the European economy, but also more recent work by Frank Nagel and his team at Harvard, who also have moved over some of their efforts to the Linux Foundation and are helping to really kind of quantify and demonstrate the scale and impact of open source technology. And we're really making that case to Europe, but this is a kind of global case that can be made as well. And then again, going back to that case for mission-driven investment as a way of kind of fueling kind of some of those economic benefits, but also acknowledging the larger societal benefits. And we'll talk about that in terms of the policy case around things like digital sovereignty, competitiveness, innovation, cybersecurity, and cyber resilience, et cetera. Right now, there is discussions being had around key pieces of legislation, such as the Cloud and AI Development Act. In the context of those discussions, we think it's very important that we situate kind of developer resources and kind of investment in open source maintainers and open source communities as part of a key dimension of what open source funding and sustainability could look like at the EU level. It's also important to link in the cybersecurity dimension. So as we move towards implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act, there's a huge conversation around cyber resilience and cybersecurity at the EU level. And there's been high-level public statements such as the Warsaw Call earlier this year. And we think in that context, it's also really important to make sure that cybersecurity kind of officials and kind of investment bodies are being made aware of the necessity of this type of funding as well. So a little bit of context. So the current multi-annual financial framework is being negotiated for 2028 to 2034. The previous version of that was from 2021 to 2027. And here you'll see kind of a bucket for innovation, so 12.4% of the EU budget. And then what you're actually talking about for Digital Europe, which is where a lot of digital investment is being channeled through, is 0.7%. So you're talking kind of really low amounts here. And then if you compare kind of the volume of kind of Digital Europe funding to the actual volume of STF investment, this is the German STF, you'll notice kind of the huge discrepancy. So actually what we're talking about is kind of that second bucket, if all STF submissions were funded, kind of scaled up to the EU level, so to speak. And we make a recommendation for a minimum contribution that's more in line with the STF investment, but ideally something more resembling if all STF submissions were funded, scaled up to the EU level. But really it's a drop in the bucket. And so it's really kind of something that I think is a strong case that can be made to policymakers. There's many who've criticized the study saying that we don't go far enough, but I think it's a great starting point, and we can talk about some of the rationale in a little bit more depth for how we got to that number. What we're talking about in terms of numbers is around 2 trillion for the current EU budget. There is, certainly a few hundred million that are earmarked for COVID recovery funds and stuff like this. But then if you look at kind of the overall total that's left, there's a European Competitiveness Fund, which is a new instrument that's kind of replacing many modalities. And as part of that, there's going to be a lot of funding going into digital technology and innovation. You can find the proposals out there, but they've made several recommendations for what that would include. And there's a strong case for open source there, though it's not been explicitly mentioned in some of the calls. So we've provided some feedback as part of that process on how that language could be strengthened in terms of the European Competitiveness Fund. But certainly, I think if you're looking at where the kind of budget would be earmarked from for an EU contribution to a centralized agency or a decentralized vehicle, or even just a kind of policy framework, that's probably where you would be looking. So what are the key findings from our feasibility study? So we really drill in on the policy rationale for the EU STF, but also the economic rationale. So on the policy side, we're really trying to explain to policymakers concretely how this kind of connects to some of their stated priorities. And the three that we really drill in on are digital sovereignty, cybersecurity, and cyber resilience, as well as competitiveness. So with digital sovereignty, we try not to take the line of the Eurostack folks, for example, around like digital independence. Like that's not really our territory. But what we're really saying is that the EU STF supports autonomy and resilience, which we think are some of the foundational aspects that enable sovereignty. So really what open source software does is it allows you to have choice, and it allows you the ability to kind of switch and to migrate in terms of crises, as well as to be kind of more resilient. It kind of just diversifies your options that are available to you. And so we're not saying that anything has to be open source. We're not saying that all credible alternatives should be open source, and that's how we combat the evil of the big tech giants. You know, there's certainly some of that thinking baked in there, but what we're really talking about is autonomy and resiliency. So enabling kind of choice, and so that's kind of the line that we kind of thread in the report. We also talk about cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So of course, the implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act, it's in the name, but also really talking about how some of these cybersecurity investments and kind of efforts, whether it's around vulnerability reporting or kind of NIS2 and kind of the implementation of that directive can be kind of coordinated with this type of funding. And really kind of be kind of commensurately matched at the EU level, even more than what the German Sovereign Tech Fund did. And then we're also talking about competitiveness. So this is explicitly in the mandate of the ECB, but it's also something that's been on the kind of tongue of every EU official since last year when the Draghi report was released. And really what that's making the case for is kind of improving European competitiveness. And this is certainly a reaction to kind of, let's say, a new dawn of far-right American exceptionalism. And so I think there's a lot of conversations being had around, how Europe can improve its economy and be more kind of independent and resilient. And so we want to make clear that this effort supports European industry and that there's naturally some kind of synergies there. So it's much less around saying these are our policy priorities, but kind of explaining to policymakers where we see this type of funding slotting into their existing priorities. When we talk around the economic rationale for the EUSTF, we kind of previewed it a little bit already, but here are some more kind of facts and figures, certainly around kind of the demand side value of open source software and kind of the importance of diversifying funding by having a public option for funding available. What we often call it in the report is public-led funding. So this is not to say that the EU is the only one contributing in or that public funding is better than any other source of funding, but that there are unique advantages of having mission-driven public investment, and that public investment can also kind of pool contributions from not just the European Commission or the EU, but also its member states and industry, and then that can exist alongside kind of community and volunteer initiatives and support. And yeah, we often talk about how open source has had challenges in finding viable commercialization paths, and so we think that these kind of modest open source software investments, particularly at that level, can yield high growth effects. And we kind of make the case for how, starting in the way that we do now can hopefully make the scale for even more, make the case for even more investment later. So in terms of the mandate of the EUSTF, we're really not proposing anything radical. This is evolutionary, not revolutionary, but we want to preserve broadly the core features of the German Sovereign Tech Fund. If you go to their website, sovereign.tech, you can see exactly what that includes. But we want to preserve that in slightly different language and with slightly different points of emphasis. We believe that the EU should contribute at least 350 million euros of its budget as part of the MFF negotiations towards this effort. We think that that is an important number, but one you shouldn't focus on too much. So what we're recommending is that as a minimum contribution, and saying that the EU and its member states should kind of contribute more together on top of that, but that the EU itself should earmark at least 350 million euros of its budget for this. And I'll mention this later, but it's possible that some of that money in the short term gets channeled through the Sovereign Tech Agency in Germany, while other modalities are being set up. So there's different permutations of how this could all play out if it does indeed play out. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, this has to be pooled financing, so it should be kind of complemented by member state and industry. This is a slight evolution of what the activities of the German Sovereign Tech Fund include. Number 2 to 4 are, yeah, slightly different kind of versions of how that's framed. We broadly refer to everything as investing in open source maintenance. When we say that, we mean investing in kind of developers and projects, so kind of community resources. But we differentiate slightly between kind of core maintenance projects, but also kind of more security focused projects, and then more improvement focused projects, which support development of specific features or emphasize certain points of kind of work that can be done in the community. And if you look at the portfolio of STF investments, you'll see some kind of nuance in terms of exactly what the money went towards and how long it played out. Some was more recurring over several years, while several of their investments were more focused on a specific aspect of the project that could be articulated over a shorter period of time. We also believe there's kind of potential for other activities. Number 1, we think that there should be some investment in kind of more research to understand our dependencies on open source software in Europe. And then number 5, we also think that there should be corresponding kind of ecosystem strengthening activities. This is very broadly defined, but there could be many versions of what this looks like, everything from skills and education courses to open source volunteer corps. Many people approach me with very interesting ideas in the recent weeks. In terms of the kind of criteria for a funding vehicle, this was where the real value of the study came in my opinion. So we talked to over 20 individuals, and we were able to kind of get a sense of like what their priorities were for such a fund if it were to scale to the EU level. And we came to these criteria. So number 1, the pooled financing and coordination that I mentioned. The fact that this should be a vehicle that has a relatively low amount of bureaucracy, so it's actually easy to apply to and report on this funding as compared to, say, Horizon Europe. If anybody's worked on a Horizon Europe project, Adrienne and I work on one. It can be very complicated, and there's a high degree of reporting and calls and administration involved in these things. And so we really want to kind of simplify that aspect. There's also a degree of political independence that needs to be in place. Funding needs to be flexible and support a number of different use cases, but also ways in which it can be delivered. There should be a strong community focus. So we don't want the EU version of the German Sovereign Tech Fund to be something that has kind of a very strong EU flavor and character and is a bit more cold and bureaucratic and removed. We still want staff from that agency to be showing up in calls like this. Paul is a member of this community, for example, and works for the Sovereign Tech Agency. And we think one of the strengths of the Sovereign Tech Agency is how they show up in the community and at conferences and this kind of thing. And so I think that should be very important. It also means kind of on the kind of definition side that there should be a strong level of engagement from the Commission in terms of co-defining what the funding would be used towards and kind of how it'll eventually be used, which feeds into the last point around transparency. So the fund must uphold transparency and governance, funding allocations, evaluation metrics, all this kind of stuff. And then there's like a lot of nerdy aspects of that we could get into with the CHAOSS community, I'm sure. And then, of course, strategic alignment, so alignment with some of those policy priorities that I mentioned. What are we actually recommending? So we have a very kind of exhaustive, around 40-page section on kind of the legal analysis side that we worked on with the European University Institute. And that's kind of the core of the study. But really what we came to the conclusion is that there's 2 most feasible scenarios in which this happens. Number 1 is not an agency, because that's actually very technically complicated to set up at the EU level, but a standalone and centralized fund. So a new funding body created by legislation. In the short term, we think one of the most pragmatic options is actually a standalone fund implemented by a HADEA. HADEA is something called the Health and Digital Executive Agency. And we believe that could be a useful vehicle to channel some of this funding in the short term, but potentially a new executive agency could be set up as well. So what you would be kind of seeing in that case would be around like a 350 million euro contribution towards a new kind of centralized fund. On the other hand, and this is potentially something that can be done at the same time. We think that there should be kind of a hybrid or shared management structure for pooling contributions towards this type of funding, and that can be implemented hopefully while all of the other logistics of a potentially centralized fund, our kind of moonshot model, are being worked out. What this probably looks like, and we investigated different alternatives, is an edict, so something called the European Digital Infrastructure Consortium. And that's a way to kind of pool financing between the EU and member states, but it's really driven by the member states, and it also allows, depending on the statutes of the edict, industry contributions. And they vary a lot in kind of what they look like in their character. So there's a lot of flexibility, which is one of the main reasons they're attractive in terms of how centralized they can be, what level of staffing they can be, and then kind of their character and how they engage in the community can vary quite significantly. So yeah, what we're recommending is kind of the setup of an edict, but it should be mentioned that there is an edict that's already emerging called the Digital Commons Edict, which we see kind of a high possibility for this type of funding to be channeled through in kind of the potentially short term. So we're having some conversations with them, but it's very possible that their name ends up changing and reflecting open source software more explicitly. But ultimately, we don't really care. We want something that's already in the process of being set up, and it's a pragmatic way to kind of distribute some of these funds. The Digital Commons Edict has had some struggles in terms of attracting funding, but we hope that if we were to kind of merge efforts, that this could be very useful in that context. But again, that's just kind of an idea, and it just gives evidence to what this type of decentralized structure might actually look like in the short term. What happens next? So really, we're doing outreach to the European Commission and the European Parliament. I should actually add the European Council in there as well. So on the 24th of September in Brussels, we'll be doing a briefing with permanent representatives, and we'll be talking about kind of the case that we're making here. We'll be kind of tracking the ongoing development of proposals surrounding the ECF. There's a lot of feedback that's still being provided as part of the MFF negotiations. And we're just continuing to get the word out and speak at events like this. So yeah, we're jumping in on community calls, but also showing up at conferences, organizing events with policymakers. We'll kind of have like a public campaign that'll kick off in 2 weeks, so organizations can express public support and interest for this project. We've also solicited a number of testimonials. So if you go to our website, you'll see testimonials from folks like SAP, Mercedes-Benz, Mozilla, the Digital Public Goods Alliance, the European University Institute, and many others. So what can you all do? Just talk about the project, just talk about the idea, like it's a good idea. And now we have a study that can say, we did our homework and really believe this is feasible at this point in time. I'll also be putting together, and I talked to somebody about this, but like a tool that might actually allow you to easily kind of copy and paste kind of language that you can use to send kind of a public letter to your MEP or to another public official. So we're exploring kind of novel ways that we'll roll out alongside the policy brief to help make sure that this study gets visibility and attention from policymakers. So yeah, here are some of the tangible ways that you can get involved. So if you want, please write a blog about it on your organization's website or talk more about it in the CHAOSS community. Add a testimonial to our website. You can get in touch and meet with me if you'd like to do that. I'll be kind of reaching out with kind of our public letter probably next week to a lot of organizations and trying to get people to sign on and kind of express support for this initiative. You can also just arrange a call with us, write a letter of public support. We'll be kind of sharing out more details in the coming weeks on all of those specific aspects. But in the meantime, just feel free to write me. I'm on the CHAOSS Slack, but I don't respond very quickly just because I'm not an active member of the community, but I can do my best to respond on there, or you can just reach out to me via email or LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect any way that you'd like to. So yeah, there's the QR code again. And yeah, thank you for having me to talk about this effort here.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. Anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts, discussion?
So Nick, I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
go ahead,
Go,
Alexander.
go ahead. It's fine.
No, just a small detail, and it might be in the report, but I missed it. Do you know how much of the current sovereign tech agency fund submissions are being rejected? And is the sole reason that they don't have enough funds to fund everyone?
Yeah, that's the reason. I think it was like something like 23 million was funded over like the last 2 years. And then I think the unmet need, I would love to have Paul here now because he has the exact numbers, but it was something like 65 or 70 million euros. So I think you're talking about like at least 2/3 of submissions don't get actually funded, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Or I'm
I
not
had
sure if it's 65 million per year over the 2-year period. Anyway, but it's less than a third. Yeah.
all right. I had another question. So on that one slide, you had this first point about the activities you want to do, and it was like I don't know, identifying or mapping European dependencies. I haven't reached or I haven't finished the whole report yet, so I wanted to ask: is there like more details in the report, or can you or do you want to elaborate a bit more on that point? I found that pretty interesting. Like, what's your general approach there to do that?
Yeah, so we keep it not too prescriptive, but also not too vague in the report. So we wanted there to be a degree of flexibility. So we kind of recommend these 5 buckets as kind of an evolutionary way of like scaling up what the STF did. But I don't feel too strongly that these should be the only areas or that I even have very strong opinions on kind of the differences between any given bucket. This was kind of based on kind of the feedback we were getting through the interviews and the discussions we were having. So I think there's a degree of kind of flexibility there. So I would caution not to take anything here too prescriptively. We were focused a bit more on the how than the what, but we think the what is very important. What I'm thinking about doing and could be very interesting is maybe over the coming months trying to outline the actual like what in a little bit more detail and trying to get more kind of community inputs and feedback on that so that we have an even stronger case for like what the fund could actually look like. But my hope is really just that this is kind of subject of like the discussions that end up in the kind of setup of the vehicle. So it's a starting point for conversation rather than anything too final or conclusive. I hope that's not an unsatisfying answer. Like I do think these are really good areas, but yeah.
No, it's not. Just so there are some more details when I go in the report regarding, especially the first point that was basically the whole question.
Yeah, there's a bit more detail, but not too much detail.
Okay,
Yeah.
I got.
And Nick, I'm wondering so far from the discussion that you had maybe with some of the EU policymakers, or I don't know if you had the chance to talk to those people that probably will be most beneficial to know about this. How has been their reaction? Did you feel kind of any pushback already that's kind of coming from the European Commission side?
So we haven't gotten any pushback. The general like impression I've been getting is that this type of feedback and understanding, whether it's through ourselves or kind of Eurostack, like the idea that there should be funding for open source seems to have like started to take root. But it's become like unclear what version of that that'll actually be like, and it hasn't really crystallized into like any sort of policy push. But just for example, we saw like very oblique offhand references to like open source developer support in Virkunen's remarks at a Eurostack event about the public AI, the AI cloud and the Cloud and AI Development Act. So we see things like that happening, and we have spoken with people in like Virkunen's cabinet. So we're like cautiously optimistic that something could happen, but we haven't heard anything formal. The one thing we have heard from Thibaut Kleiner's office in DG Connect was some signal that a version of this kind of recommendation was made by the Commission in their negotiations to the MFF, which is very positive. We haven't gotten any formal feedback on what that actually looks like or what that actually means. So it could be a slightly different version of this. It could be a very different version of this. We don't really have a lot of insider clarity on that, and they're not very forthcoming because they don't like to discuss like ongoing negotiations, generally speaking. So I'd say we're like hopeful. That was like a positive email to receive, but we don't know anything formal as of yet.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Nick, for taking the time to come and hang out with us and give the presentation again. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Thank you guys for your attention and support. And yeah, if you want to be in touch, let me put the link to the report in the chat, and then I'll also put my email.
Yeah, it was really great to hear about all the things that are going on. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And I'll drop the, are you okay with me dropping the email in the notes as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, please do.
Okay, cool. All right. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See you. We'll
Thanks
see
so
you in
much.
2 weeks
Cheers.
for our
Bye-bye.
feedback session.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.